Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Enlightenment Now series, where we're looking at Steven Pinker's book on the progress humanity has made over the past 250 years. We're coming to the end of this series, and in this episode we're looking at happiness. So we've seen throughout this series how over the past 250 years we've become increasingly better at meeting our basic needs. In the last episode we saw that we have much more time to do the things we care about, but are we any happier? So how could we potentially have made all this progress, but if you look around, people are still quite miserable? Here are the top 5 facts you need to know when it comes to happiness and progress. Number 1, some things do make us a little bit happier. So we shouldn't really expect the kind of wonderful achievements of modernity to make us massively more happy. If we spend all our time marveling at the fact that we have a secure food source, that we live in relatively peaceful democratic societies, that we're not dying of infectious diseases, we wouldn't really get a lot of stuff done. So on average, we see that people in richer countries are a little bit happier than people in poorer countries, and these can be put down to some relatively obvious factors such as GDP growth, such as healthy life expectancy, social support, levels of generosity, trust, and freedom. So we know that there are these kind of things that make some countries happier than other countries. We know within countries that things such as employment, good health, decent level of income, a good marriage make people happier too. But we're not going to expect that these will solve all our problems because we've still got plenty of stuff to do. If we spent, again, all our time being happy as a result of having these things, we're not going to be focusing on all the tasks at hand, the fact that we've got to go to work, the fact that we've got some exercise to do, the fact that we want to spend more time with the people we love. And this is what produces those common frustrations, disappointments, feelings of loneliness or sadness that keep us motivated in life. So we're never going to be much happier, but it does seem like people today are a little bit happier than people in the past. Fact number 2, people are not necessarily more lonely. So this idea that we're a little bit happier today than we were in the past can seem intuitive. On the one hand, we don't have to worry where our next meal is coming from, we don't have to necessarily worry about dying in battle, but it can be also a bit counterintuitive as well. Like, it doesn't look like people are that happy, as I said at the beginning of this video. In particular, one factor seems to stand out in that, aren't we just a bit lonely? So without the kind of traditional community and familial ties that used to really ground us in life, are we not all striving for a sense of belonging? Are we not kind of desperately searching for true love to fill this hole inside us? So Pinker looks at this and he kind of shows that although, yes, the social landscape has dramatically changed and become a much more individualized one over the past 250 years, it looks like people still have the same amount of contact time with others and have the same amount of quality relationships with each other. So people do have smaller families, there are more single people, there are more women at work, but people still report the same amount of emotional support, the same amount of satisfaction, and with the number and quality of their friendships, and the same amount of time spent with children and relatives. Even something like the impact of social media doesn't seem to have made a massive difference to the amount and quality of people's social lives, even if it has a little bit reduced the amount of face-to-face time people spend with their friends. Though when asked, the same people say that they think that social media has actually enhanced those friendships and interactions. So it looks like, despite the massive changes that we've seen over modernity in terms of our social lives, people have managed to kind of adapt and maintain a few supportive, intimate relationships. They've managed to maintain spending time with relatives and managed to maintain spending time with children. So that's a fairly robust finding that maybe actually people aren't necessarily more lonely these days, but actually loneliness is actually just a feature of the human condition, and our social beings, social life is hard, and loneliness is something that we all have to live with from time to time. Fact number 3, we are paying more attention to mental illness. So again, we might sort of think, okay, so even if people are not necessarily more lonely, isn't there a kind of a wider problem here? Doesn't modern society not just kind of encourage individualism, but also a kind of mental illness? Now, this might not be necessarily due to atomization, but due to some other feature of modern life, maybe urbanization, maybe the separation from nature, maybe the impact of 24-hour news or social media or work demands or whatever. But is the progress that we made worth it if it's seemingly making us more mentally ill, more depressed, more anxious, more addicted? Now, it's certainly true that mental illness is on the rise, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are more people mentally ill today than in the past. Now, how can that be? Well, it might partly be an issue of measurement. So people nowadays are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness, so we have more treatments for mental illness. Mental illness might be the sort of thing that we can start paying attention to when other concerns have got out the way. So certainly prior to the kind of second half of the 20th century, mental health treatment like we know it is, like we see today, was partly non-existent. We no longer leave mentally ill patients to kind of rot in a gloomy asylum. In fact, people are expected to receive mental health treatment and in the long run continue to lead relatively happy lives, much the same as everyone else. So I think what we're seeing here is a kind of medicalization of the sort of struggles of relatively normal life. Now that has its problems of its own. It can detract from personal agency, it can detract from various social systemic causes of suffering. But the extent to which it does partly depends on how we view mental illness in general. Mental illness might be relatively similar to physical illness. It might be something quite common. It might be relatively temporary and normal conditions that are caused by the wear and tear of everyday life. And much like physical illness, we do see that most people experience mental illness throughout their lifetime, around about 80%. So it might be that mental illness is not so different to chronic loneliness in this respect. It might be not necessarily a feature of modernity, but a feature of the human condition. It's just that we're starting to pay more attention to it, and that may well be a good thing. Fact number 4, freedom doesn't necessarily make us happy. So one of the most well-known findings in the happiness literature is that happiness is U-shaped over the lifespan. So we're happiest when we're young, and we're happiest when we're old, and we're the least happy during middle age. And this is probably because middle age is the time at which we have the most responsibilities, we have the greatest amount of ambition too. We have various work demands, we're at the kind of peak of our careers, we have various pressures of family life, probably with children, we're having to deal with aging parents as well, taking on all those extra responsibilities. So all these things are part of a kind of good, meaningful life, but they're not exactly happiness inducing, they're actually quite sort of stressful and demanding. And it's possible that modernity in general, in that it produces all these additional opportunities and therefore responsibilities for individuals, is kind of like middle age, but for everyone all the time. So this could explain, for example, why over the past 30 years, women have actually become, they're kind of the one demographic in society that have become less happy as time has gone on. That is women in the US and Europe that have gained various freedoms. So women report now that they have life goals that include career, family, marriage, money, recreation, friendship, experience, correcting social inequalities, being a leader in their community and making a contribution to society. Now, that's quite a lot of things to do and quite a lot of things to worry about. And as global citizens, we may all kind of find ourselves in this situation where we can't rest content in our village life anymore. We have, to some extent, the weight of the world on our shoulders. We have the media and 24/7 news kind of feeding these anxieties, reporting one crisis after another. Now, whether that anxiety is kind of being inflamed or not, it's still real. There really are a host of problems to worry about, whether that be democracy, polarization, inequalities, climate change, who knows. And we're now privileged and lucky enough to be able to care about and do something about these things. And insofar as we do something positive about them, that's good. These freedoms are good. It's just they may not make us happier in the long run. Fact number 5. Technological advances may create very different kinds of happiness. So people throughout history have worried about the impact of technology on people's mental lives. So, for example, trains and industrial machinery were seen as noisy disruptions of pastoral village life that put people on edge. Telephones interrupted quiet times in houses. Watches and clocks, people worried about making a kind of dehumanization or time pressures on factory workers to be productive during the Industrial Revolution. Radio and television, people worried, were being organized around advertising that enabled modern consumer culture, heightened people's status as ICs. There's a whole host of these things going all the way back to the printing press. Now, it's, we've lived through trains, telephones, watches, radios, televisions, and we haven't come out at the other side too traumatized. So it looks like humans are pretty good at adapting to technology. The current worries we have, for example, around the internet and social media may not destroy people's mental faculties as we project they might. But I think it's also reasonable to say, even if humans are pretty good at adapting to technologies, it might be that these technologies still fundamentally change our psychological lives. And you can kind of get a taste of this if you're ever lucky enough to go traveling around different cultures in the world. The way people can think in other cultures can be completely different. The pace of life can be completely different. The way people feel inside their own bodies or around others can be profoundly different. And that doesn't mean that some cultures are much happier than other cultures. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But it is possible that some cultures and the impact of different technologies can create fundamentally different kinds of inner lives, fundamentally different kinds of happinesses than in others. So the happiness of modernity might be characterized around feelings of achievement, around individual enjoyment, purpose and fulfillment. Whereas it might be that happiness of past times or in more traditional cultures hasn't been impacted by various technologies. Like we have are more centered around feelings of connection or attunement or collective belonging. Now, it may be impossible to compare these different kinds of happiness. Like, as I say, neither is sort of better or worse than the other. But I think it's important to realize that modernity and the relatively huge psychological changes caused by technological advances may have traded in one kind of happiness and inner life for another.